Hi, everybody. I'm Randy Bach today, as in on many days, and I'm honored as on very few days, but some, to have with me the brilliant Jonathan Leaf. And we're going to talk philosophy. So, Jonathan, what is philosophy, literally? How has it been applied? Are the philosophers the right point to be? Have they been the right people to espouse philosophy? And what is your current work on in the topic?
Yeah, I think these are big questions that are sort of unasked often in philosophy classes. So thank you so much for having me on. So I guess I was telling you before we went on that I had a novel published last year, as you know, which got and the publisher of the novel asked me to do a Substack, and I started publishing as part of the Substack a short history of philosophy that I'd written in my spare time during the pandemic, actually. And the question I think you're bringing up is exactly right. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom or the study of wisdom. And a lot of the people who are studying philosophy classes, and I'm talking about Socrates or Plato, Rousseau, we can mention a number of Hegel. They don't seem to display much wisdom. I mean, it would be very hard to find much wisdom in them. And many of the people who are promoting their ideas seem to fit that old comment of Orwell's about only an intellectual could believe that no ordinary person can be so stupid. So that's a real question. I don't mean this as a blanket condemnation of the field, because there are really brilliant people who are profound and wise that are covered in philosophy classes. But a lot of the stuff covered in philosophy classes, Rousseau and Marx are particularly egregious examples. They don't appear to display much wisdom, and that's a real problem. So the book is a critical history of philosophy. It's not some kind of enthusiastic endorsement of everything taught in philosophy classes.
It's on your Substack right now, and I'll pop up your Substack so people can see it. But is it going to be a book? And before we talk, say about the characteristics of what form it will take, I'd like to know how you became interested in the topic yourself, and at what age were you attracted to philosophy? How has it served you, and how has it served people in general?
Well, I like many people, I got exposed to it in college for the most part. Actually, that's not entirely true. I read Nietzsche, and I read some other stuff in high school. But many people, in college, you get exposed to these so-called great philosophers. I say so-called because they're not all. And then right after college, actually, I was briefly employed by Rutgers University. I taught a summer class in philosophy, though I actually hadn't even been to graduate school at that point. And just over time, come to be more and more critical of a lot of what's taught and a lot of the basic ideas. And I think you and I, before we went on with this interview, you were asking, what the place of philosophy is. And I think that's a valid question, too. I mean, there's certainly political philosophy has enormous value, because we have to address this question of how do we organize ourselves as societies. But ethics, which is one of the subjects that philosophy addresses to great degree, I think it's a legitimate question. How much philosophy can provide people in lieu of religion? I mean, Spinoza's example of this. Spinoza's ethics are supposedly very profound, very great. I don't know if more than 4 people ever read Spinoza's ethics and then said, oh, well, this is what I've got to do. There's no question, though, that people, when they go to church or synagogue or mosque, whatever it may be, that this does influence their daily life, perhaps less than people would talk about whitened sepulchres and talk about the hypocrisy of religious people. But there's no doubt most religious people are greatly influenced by the ethical systems that they're taught, the belief systems they're taught. I don't know how much philosophy actually achieves in that realm. So I think that's a legitimate question.
So along my reading of your writings, there's the concept of whether Karl Marx is a philosopher. Whether he was or was not, we'd have to decide who is it. I mean, with baseball players, it's usually easier to decide if somebody has been a baseball player or not. Whether they're a good baseball player is harder to tell. But basically, they have to be on the team. They have to, oftentimes wear a uniform. Be a professional player. They're getting a salary. they have a position, they're getting graded, they have hits and so forth. And so there are a lot of things. I mean, I take some mental refuge in sports because it's kind of an absolute system. There's no, you can talk about DEI on at various businesses and so forth, but DEI doesn't really play out in sports because you want the best player to hit or shoot or whatever it is your sport mandates. With philosophers, it seems to be much more of a vogue that the top players in the sport of philosophy, they vary by time, and it's really kind of in an ebb and flow. You point out that the kind of it goes in a sense with what is the predominant country at the time. We were talking about European philosophy. So during the Napoleonic era, there were philosophers that were prominent, but French. And then after that,
Right.
with some waning of the Napoleonism and France in general, it shifted over to Germany, and that persisted until World War II. I'm not sure who the players are right now, but and again, it's because the NBA has objective standards, and NFL has we know who wins and loses, and which players get to persist in their contracts, and we can see their value by how much they get paid, so forth. Now, philosophy, is it a little bit like diets? Faddish. People always come to me with one diet or another. Is this the best diet? The keto diet, the lettuce diet, the carb diet. This, and I'm like, well, the fact that one keeps superseding the other, every few years would imply to me that none of them work unless it's the very last one. But we don't really know yet. But wait 5 years and it'll be something else. So is it just literally almost like fashion? Shorts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think without question. I mean, even people that people think of as eternally important, these so-called immortals of philosophy. Plato's Republic is regarded today as this book that has always been the central work in Western philosophy, except it's not true. It wasn't even translated into English until 1763. Most of the major English philosophers of the empiricist period had never read it. I looked into this and I couldn't find any evidence that Hume or Adam Smith or Locke had ever read it. Hobbes, I'm sure, had read it. Hobbes was very familiar with Greek writing in general. He did a translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. But Voltaire talks about Plato. I don't think Voltaire had ever read it. Many people were interested in, they called them the divine dialogues, certain much shorter dialogues of Plato that deal with the idea of ideal forms. But this philosophical work dealing with politics that I'm sure Plato considered his major work for most of his life, the Republic, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that it certainly wasn't read in the Middle Ages. Nobody even had copies of it in Europe. And even when, after the fall of Constantinople, copies turned up in Europe, nobody seems to have thought it was particularly important, which until really the end of the 18th century, which makes sense given how crazy it is. But recently, there's been this idea that it's a very important work. But we could go beyond that and say, they're early 20th century, 19th century philosophers who were taken very seriously. They're philosophers who won the Nobel Prize, who are almost completely forgotten today. These are people who wrote within the last 100 years, and they were very briefly considered very important, and then they were almost completely forgotten. We even have this very weird case of Wittgenstein, where he started out with one set of philosophical values. He claimed that he was trying to produce a pure logical system of philosophy, and then in his Tractatus, and then later with his philosophical investigations, which were published posthumously, he said, no, I'm not trying to do that at all. It's impossible to deal with lots of philosophical questions because of the inherent limitations of language. What I was doing at the beginning was a complete waste of time. And there are people who are fascinated by both works without even realizing that there's an inherent contradiction here. So no, there's no question that works come into vogue. They become very popular, and also the interpretations of them. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, Nietzsche was of great interest to people because of his racist ideas. And then later, they kind of expunged all that. Perhaps to some extent, fairly or justly, because it turns out he was very hostile to Germany and to German intellectualism and German art and culture in certain ways. And it turns out though he made many comments that could be construed as anti-Semitic, he also really admired a lot of Jewish artists like Mendelssohn and Heinrich Heine. But there's no question they're fads. I mean, a current one is there's this writer, Judith Butler, who's the one who's come up with the idea of that, lesbian feminists should have a natural reason to feel connected to Islamic radicals and communists in Cuba and so forth. And most of us regard this as a ridiculous idea because we're in the real world, the sane world. We're not crazy. But the point is, there are a lot of people who are really interested in these ideas. We can see it in college campuses with a lot of these protests that are going on right now. So yeah, there's no question. There's a real element of faddishness in philosophy, and it's one of the problems.
So to get back to Plato's Republic per se, I have only kind of read it bits and pieces. My wife is a classicist, so I absorb some of these concepts by proxy, and in conversation obliquely, whatnot. But my understanding of Plato's Republic is that Karl Marx might very well have enjoyed it. I don't know if he read it or not. Has Plato's Republic?
Well, one of the big influences on Marx, whether perhaps indirectly, like you said, is Rousseau, and Rousseau did say that he considered the Republic the greatest work on education ever written. So we know Rousseau was very influenced by the Republic. He had read it. It was translated into French before it was translated into English. There's a French translation that exists as a single volume from like the 1720s. And Rousseau had read it, and Rousseau was very influenced. But yeah, the whole idea of a new society based on totalitarian structure, which there would be limited property, and you'd kind of remake the whole of society. That idea does seem to have influenced Rousseau and indirectly Marx. Absolutely.
So the fact that I probably no secret, I went to school, and probably you did too. And I had a kind of a reverence for schooling and for studying, and I was a good boy. I tried to do well in my classes, and apparently did well enough to be commended with more school. The reward for doing well in school is school. But I've come over the years to have a little bit more skepticism about what goes on in schools and why certain things are there. And I went to kind of I guess an elite secondary school for high school. New York City, and Plato's Republic was taught. Why did it show up in the school versus some other works? Say, maybe those of Adam Smith or something like that. Is there, you mentioned selection bias in your work on philosophy, as that a certain amount of philosophy is through the lens of these guys who are philosophers. So it's not as, say, manifold or accessible as certain aspects of science, which can be seen through different lenses objectively. But is there, again, kind of this bias that gets put upon people, the way many people get their news about, one candidate or another through their own political lens. People who only hear about Donald Trump through MSNBC have kind of a skewed version of him. So, a little bit like the seven blind men and the elephant, are we just getting these sense and sensibilities about philosophical concept through imposition?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's exactly what it is. And I think Republic, and there are other works we could talk about too, Rousseau and Marx being examples, they appeal to intellectuals. But we would have to ask the question, are these sane or rational ideas? In the case of Socrates, one of the things that particularly should indict, or Plato, should indict these people is that, they lived in the Periclean age. They didn't live in something like a Periclean age. They lived in the actual Periclean age. They lived in a time period when Athens had a higher standard of living than any society that existed for about 2,000 years afterwards, all the way up until probably about the 1600s in the Netherlands. No society in the world, in China, India, no society in the world seems to have had as high a standard of living as the Periclean age Athenians. They also produced Sophocles, Euripides, the sculptures of Phidias. They built the Parthenon. Plato, who set up the academy, was the boss of people who made major discoveries in geometry and, to a lesser extent, mechanical engineering. This was an incredible period of human discovery and achievement, and they were against it. They openly said, we think, Sparta is a better country, a better city-state. Sparta, 90% of the people were slaves, and every year they had an annual festival where they would take out the best students and they would kill the slaves for kicks. That's what they thought was better. These are people who are really, really far out. And people kind of forget what Socrates' trial was about. It's pretty apparent, and we have Plato's account, we have Xenophon's account, they were his disciples. But we don't have an account from any objective source, but we can use common sense based on what they tell us. One of Socrates' former students, this guy Critias, became the leader of something called the 30 Tyrants. They were a group of people who took power after Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian Wars. And they killed somewhere between 3 and 5% of all the citizens within 8 months. They stole a lot of the wealth of the country within 8 months. And after they were thrown out of office and a democracy was reestablished, there was a desire to prevent this from happening again. And one of the first things they did is they looked at who were the leaders of the 30 Tyrants. Well, the leader was a former student of Socrates, who's also Plato's first cousin once removed, Critias. The head of the cavalry was Xenophon, another of Socrates' students. The general in charge of their main port, Charmides, was also Plato's uncle, was also one of Socrates' students. There were a whole series of leaders of this tyranny, this horrible oligarchy that was imposed, who overthrew the democracy, tried to create perhaps this ideal republic Socrates had been teaching them about, who were closely connected to Socrates. So they definitely wanted him out of town. And it seems that what they wanted was for him to ask for exile, which is reasonable given what happened. And he refused. He insisted on being executed. And the way they executed him was they forced him to drink hemlock. Now, where did this innovation of killing someone, executing someone by drinking hemlock come from? Oh, the 30 Tyrants introduced this punishment, and they used it on thousands of people. So this was a classic example of the punishment fits the crime. And everybody who saw or knew of Socrates' punishment and his death would have understood that. So that's the context in which we should think about Socrates and Plato. Except it gets worse, and that Plato then, after he'd had some success setting up the academy, went to the city of Syracuse, which was not a democracy, and tried to create philosopher kings, tried to do what Socrates said he was going to do, and it was a disaster. And then he came back to Athens, and he started doing these philosophical writings. So these were people who had abundant reason to understand what was beneficial about democracy and what was terrible about totalitarian or authoritarian regimes. Does this display wisdom? I think most people say it does not display wisdom. And that's the context in which we should read these writings, but that's not the context in which they're generally taught. So that's a problem, to my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like hearing about the age of COVID through, Dr. Fauci, Deborah Birx, and so forth. I mean, you anything has a lens.
Exactly.
And so, I think there is an objective reality. I don't know which branch of philosophy that puts me in, but you're going to get your ideas and concepts and what you think might be previous facts through some kind of chain of custody, and that if certain people are left out of submission, of being able to add to that general canon of knowledge, then you're going to get something skewed. So there's bias, and bias is a big issue for obviously for science, and it should be for philosophy, but it doesn't seem to be. And it seems to be that there's always this kind of like push from the schools to remake society in this kind of like totalitarian way. And getting back to sports, there's an old expression that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. If you are handsome and gorgeous, whatever, you go into Hollywood and then you're adored and you have these roles and so forth. I mean, you probably have issues beside that. I'm not going to get into it. And if you're really good at athletics, you can go into professional sports. And if you're tall, you probably can do both. You can be Bill Bradley and go into sports and then politics, or from sports into screen acting, like the famous screen idol O.J. Simpson. I mean, maybe not giving good examples here, but the fact of the matter is that I'm just wondering, is a fair amount of what we see from academics that based on that old kind of dictum, those who can do, those who can't teach, and is this kind of like become a politics of envy for those who can and do from those who can't, and then it becomes a vindictive aspect of getting back. I mean, I think that Marxism is a politics of envy, and if you can't make and build and do something, you can take it from the people who have. And historically, people got ahead through, like your 30 tyrants, whatever, by raping and pillaging and stealing. It's only later in kind of the Adam Smithian view of the virtuous circle that people can get ahead by helping each other, by working at something they're good at, and everyone gets ahead. It becomes a positive sum game as opposed to a zero sum game, where there's a certain amount of wealth, and it becomes a matter of getting that gold and stealing it and then capturing a sort of a kind of game of capture of the flag. So, I don't want to indict all of philosophy, because I think there's some fascinating questions about it. I think we all engage with it in some way or another. But is there good philosophy? Is there bad philosophy? And are there good purveyors of say, the better path?
Wow, so many questions. Wow. I agree with so many things you said, but let me try to address those answers. I think you've provided the answers. So yeah, I think part of the problem is that intellectuals who teach philosophy are attracted to certain types of thinkers. And I say there's what I call the typical philosopher, I say exhibits the big four. The big four, they're irritable, they're disagreeable, they're unattractive to the opposite sex, and they're melancholy. This is the typical philosopher.
I want you to repeat that. I want to hear those again.
Irritable, disagreeable. I think it's irritable. I think it's irritable, disagreeable, melancholy, and unattractive to the opposite sex. That describes most philosophers, most of the famous philosophers. In Socrates' case, I think he was more interested in men than women, but he was famously ugly. I mean, this is kind of characteristic of philosophers. Rousseau was actually not a bad-looking guy, but he had all sorts of weird health problems, and he had no money, and for much of his life. And they're usually people who are very unhappy, and they have this kind of gestalt. And the gestalt is interesting people. They have a kind of worldview, that's very interesting to people. But that doesn't make it wisdom. That doesn't. But are there great philosophers? Yeah, I think there are. And in this history, I talk about someone really. While people may be appalled by what Machiavelli is saying, there's no question Machiavelli had great insight into the nature of particularly authoritarian society, though he was actually a believer in representative government and had fought for it and worked for it and so forth. Montesquieu, came up with the whole idea of balance of powers. Incredibly great philosopher. De Tocqueville, amazing thinker. And someone who, by the way, all these people had been involved in real world politics. They had real experience with politics. Machiavelli had helped run the Florentine state. De Tocqueville had been a judge. And not de Tocqueville, he had been a judge, actually. I was going to say Montesquieu had been a judge. De Tocqueville had been a judge. He was actually Minister of Foreign Affairs briefly in the French Republic, the Second Republic. So these people actually knew what they were talking about. They weren't just sitting in a room angrily coming up with propositions. So I think there's one living philosopher I think is an amazing thinker, and I think you and I have chatted about Thomas Sowell. There are a whole bunch of writers we could mention who are really great and original philosophers. Adam Smith. I think actually that brings up another point, which is that philosophy tends to dismiss other fields, including economics. They used to call economists the worldly philosophers. And I think it's a good description. How you produce wealth and how you allocate resources, these are the basic questions of economics. These are profound philosophical questions. So you really can't talk about philosophy, to me, at least political philosophy, without making some acknowledgement of economics. In fact, that's one of the issues with people like John Rawls, that they're talking about moral questions that deal with the issue of scarcity of resources without talking about economic consequences. And I do think Rawls was a really original thinker, and I'm not dismissing Rawls, but you have to also address these questions too. You can't talk about one without the other. Well, this idea that there's no such thing as objective truth, which is often advanced in philosophy classes, and I guess I literally heard at a dinner party a couple of weeks ago from somebody who had studied with someone who had studied with Karl Popper, the Viennese philosopher. It's certainly, obviously, it's very difficult to determine what objective truth is, but the notion that there's no objective truth runs into a big problem, which is that we have all these scientific and technical achievements that have emerged in recent centuries, which would be impossible if there were no objective truth. So how did we send someone to the moon 250,000 miles from here and get them back? How is it that people developed a nuclear weapon? How is it that you have a cell phone in your pocket that relies on literally billions of circuits that are sending messages all along a series of millions and millions of circuits, connections up into space to a satellite, back to your phone, and then telling the phone through all these circuits how to create a picture on the screen. How would that be possible if there were no objective truth? Obviously, there is objective truth, whether or not we can easily determine it.
You make excellent points there. Obviously, for some silly reason, this thought occurred to me. I mean, we are a species that's interesting. I mean, every species technically is unique, but we have really I suppose the prime position on Earth as the species that knows how to read and write and create smartphones out of sand and rocks mixed in with lightning. So I'm wondering if other species somehow came up with philosophy. I don't think they have the luxury of time to do so. There's kind of the parsimony of the forest, of the jungle, and so forth, where animals are pretty much on an entire as needed basis, get food every day, and if you have a little bit extra, then it's time to breed, and you have your generation, and then you die, kind of thing. So I don't think they have the capabilities and abilities of Periclean Athenians to sit back and have a literal symposium of which means drinking together. I assume a little bit of wine, whatnot. They don't know how to make that stuff, and so forth. But maybe some of the species that might come closest are dogs, who have pretty much a life of luxury, unlike domesticated dogs. That is, unlike any other animal on Earth, perhaps except for cats, maybe a few parakeets, whatnot. But if dogs had philosophers, there could be various schools of philosophy within the canine kingdom, and some might be part of the Michael Vick school of battling dogs against each other, and others might kind of be more interested in the Westminster school of training, and there might be some profound ethics of being that perfect dog with perfect movement and whatnot. But we would be able to see it as some of the absurdities of what it is, that it's so dependent on your circumstance and who which household you wind up being in. That being said, the dogs still have some objective reality. They need to eat every day. They have societal realities of mating and moods and sniffing and whatnot, and they have their own parameters. It's just kind of always seems to be a mildly humorous thing that humans spend so much time thinking about this, but only when they can. I mean, at certain places they can't, and they don't, and they won't. And we see maybe philosophy show up as a capability of dominant cultures with extra spare time, if that's not redundant.
Yeah, and I think that many of the most influential philosophers were people who had too much time on their hands. I don't think there's any question about them. That includes some ones that I think you and I really admire, like Locke and Smith, who were academics and they had lots of time on their hands. But there's no question. I mean, Socrates is an example of this, and Plato are examples of this. Socrates was a stonemason. At some point in his 40s, he got an inheritance, and he basically decided he wasn't going to work anymore. He just hung out trying to meet young men whom he professed he was teaching. It's a real surprise, by the way, that his wife was very unhappy with him, Xanthippe. And Plato came from a wealthy family too, and he used this money and his connections to try and help set up the academy. These were idle, wealthy people. Socrates may not have been that wealthy, but they had a lot of time on their hands, and in a way, this is bad because they were busy doing this rather than doing ostensibly productive things, and they often didn't have to think through how things actually work in the real world. And I think that's one of the real contrasts between the philosophers who actually were involved in things like governance and the philosophers who just sat in a garret coming up with angry, resentful reasons to unmake civil society. And Marx would be kind of a quintessential example of this. And he was financed, of course, his friend Engels gave him money to come up with his various screeds and tirades.
Yeah, I read Paul Johnson's Intellectuals after, I think, reading Modern Times. I don't know if Paul Johnson was a philosopher or not. He was an interesting historian. And like so many can't tell, it's when you see these movies about rock and roll bands or something like that, there's basically one arc. They're all scrappy kids. They get together. They find out they can sing. They get in front of a few bands. They want to meet girls. Then they get famous. Then they do cocaine. Then they do this drug. So they have this whole dissolution, then resolution, kind of arc. And then you watch the documentary of them years later. They're on their reunion tour. One of them has died because of overdose or something like that. And the rest of them all get together. They've all been through AA and blah, blah, blah. Everyone lives happily ever after to a point, blah, blah, blah. And you buy their new album. But what's the point there? It seems that a lot of these, arcs follow the same pathway with philosophers, that they it's almost the opposite. They start out rich, and then they kind of, work in a sense downward, kind of like negate the wealth or kind of work out through the guilt of having something that other people don't. And you get all these kind of proto-Marxists or pre-Marxists in the case of Rousseau and perhaps Plato, who just have, some kind of resentment that they can't, I think there's something, interesting about, that men, I think philosophy has been a man's game. That men have to get the stuff. They have to get their meat. They have to, hunt it down and get it in order to be validated. When you're given it, I think there's some short circuit in the brain that negates all the action thereof. And then you have to kind of figure out how crappy society was because it gave you all this stuff without working for it, although you don't phrase it that way. And then it plays out in all these kind of resentments, and so the arc I was going to get to was for Paul Johnson, like every other almost writer, philosopher, professor who's a conservative. It's like, oh, he started out as a Marxist, like Thomas Sowell, we mentioned, started out, I believe, as a Marxist, socialist or communist or whatever, one of those things, before he had kind of his epiphany. I think it was on a bus or something like that. We can get into a later point, but Paul Johnson, started out as a socialist. But all these guys, so there's kind of like two types of professors out there: those who start out as socialists and stay that way, and the very rare breed who doesn't. I don't know if you want to speak to any of that.
Well, just about Johnson and Sowell, both of whom I'm huge admirers of. And I feel very fortunate that I actually met Johnson once briefly, like just to shake his hand and then talk to his wife and a friend named John O'Sullivan, who used to be the editor of National Review for, 20 or 30 minutes at a cocktail party once. Johnson denied that he'd ever been a Marxist. He was a, active Labor Party member and, some kind of quasi-socialist, but he claims that he was never actually a Marxist. Sowell was very much a Marxist. In fact, he wrote he worked on his graduate thesis, his undergraduate thesis at Harvard was about Das Kapital, and he learned German to read it. So yeah, I think that this is not unusual. Of course, there's that comment attributed to Churchill which it's never been proven he actually said it, that if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're 40, you have no head. And I for which I have a lot of sympathy. And I think if you'd met me when I was 18 or 19, I probably would have told you I was a socialist. I think Marx is an important point. And if I could just say a little more about Marx. One of the interesting things about Marx is that economists, by and large, with very few exceptions, in fact, I would go so far as to say, don't consider him an economist, which makes sense because he didn't know about one of the basic ideas in economics that was developed in his lifetime and widely accepted in his lifetime, but he didn't keep up with economics, which is marginal utility, which is used to explain why people buy what they do and how the price system works in a market economy. He had no familiarity with this. He believed in a discredited idea called the labor theory of value, which basically says that things are expensive because there's a lot of labor in them, and then there's an additional thing which he calls surplus value, we would probably call profit. His explanation is a little more complicated because he does know about depreciation and some other things. That's his basic explanation. And most economists just kind of laugh at this. This is like having a theory of physics in which there's no gravity. By the way, the theory that labor value explains things, even Smith, who sort of believed in it, knew it was wrong at some level because he came up with this famous thing called the diamond water paradox, where he pointed out that there's this weird thing that you walk into Sahara and you have a diamond with you, you'll gladly swap it for a cup of water. So something's not right with this theory. But anyway, all of Marxist economics is based on this, which is why it's not really economics. So he's not really an economist. And yet people have imported and economics textbooks, for instance, if you read the Krugman textbook, that's the most widely used high school textbook on economics, it actually doesn't mention Marx. It's about 800 pages. Marx has never mentioned textbook. Krugman's a leftist, but he doesn't even bother mentioning Marx because he knew he'd be laughed at if he mentioned Marx. So most economists kind of regard him as a joke, but he's been imported into philosophy because he has some supposed wisdom to provide based on his knowledge of his economics, of which there's none or very little. So it's really very bizarre. And yet he's one of the most influential figures in modern philosophy. And if people in philosophy had more familiarity with economics, psychology, anthropology, et cetera, I think the field would be much better off. And to be fair, there are some academics now who are trying to incorporate ideas from other fields, including psychology in particular. And I think that's a healthy trend. But this is a big problem. They have this kind of closed system, and they've decided on certain kind of essential works, starting with Plato's Republic. And they're not interested in any kind of assessment of whether these works are actually real philosophy or whether their ideas can be proven in any kind of real world way, whether they have any logical validity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to segue slightly. I was wondering if you could talk about kind of like more recent philosophy from Kierkegaard onward to what we have, and what are the, or if you could just be a cork on the water and give us a kind of an assessment of how we've gone through philosophy of the ages. We could go back a little bit further, but Andrew Klavan was talking about Kierkegaard just the other day, and I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us what his thoughts were and how has philosophy changed since his time?
Well, I think he's often said to be the first existentialist. And one point that should be made is that there are many works of philosophy which are fun to read. They're enjoyable. The Symposium is a really fun philosophical story. And apparently, I don't know ancient Greek, but many people claim that it's a masterpiece of style in Greek. I think most of us would say that reading Nietzsche is a lot of fun. Reading Pascal is a lot of fun. I think there's some of that with Kierkegaard too. Kierkegaard is regarded as first existentialist because he's very interested in this idea of how do we experience life, and he was specifically interested, of course, in how do we achieve salvation through some kind of personal experience, some kind of personal spiritual journey. And he wasn't really interested in Orthodox Christianity of any sort. I mean, his background was Protestant, but he wouldn't have been interested in Catholic Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy either. I think there's no doubt he's a really original writer and sometimes an entertaining writer. But again, he's one of these weirdos he came from money. He's living in a garret somewhere. He's writing these crazy essays. It doesn't seem totally connected to the real world. And I think the average person probably would say, I don't know how much I'm getting from this. I don't know how much wisdom I'm getting from this. And that's a problem. But he starts this kind of philosophical trend, which includes Nietzsche and Heidegger and so forth, where philosophy becomes very personal. And existentialism is, is philosophy, and it reaches its apogee or depth with people like Sartre, who say, existence precedes essence. So in other words, we have this being, we have this potentially consciousness that exists before we actually have physical essence. And now I know you're a medical doctor, and I think you can tell the people listening far better than I that this is actually a physical impossibility and nonsensical. In Sartre's case, it becomes particularly ridiculous because he also claimed to be a Marxist. Marxism claims to be, not that it is, it claims to be a purely materialistic philosophy. So how can you be purely materialistic and yet also existentialist? It's impossible. It's sort of like saying, I'm really committed to skiing, but I'm a quadriplegic who never leaves home. You can't be both. It doesn't work that way.
Well, unless you have an Oculus or something like that. I mean, theoretically, there are versions of skiing that you could imagine yourself doing. And these
I,
days,
I can think of it. I came up with that with the analogy off the top of my head. Forgive me. I'm sure we come up with
no,
a
no,
better one.
no, no. I mean, I think it's there, and it also brings up the question. Is Sartre just really kind of a religious, um, does he have religiosity without wanting to name it that? He wants to be, more of a L. Ron Hubbard, starting on religion without actually, going to the church he might have been brought up in. And again, this gets back to kind of resentment and having to do it your way. I think a lot of it has, a lot of these things come down to resentments. And Karl Marx himself, he's not personally to blame. I think his father and grandfather, I think they were Halevi. I think his grandfather was a rabbi and a prominent one, and the father wanted to pursue a career in X, Y, and Z, but he was barred by his Jewish name, and rather than double down on the Jewish thing and do what people might do today, and if you're felt a little bit aggrieved as a Muslim, you might take a very opposite tack. But they kind of they sublimated and subsumed themselves in German Lutheranism or whatever Protestant branch, and then I guess had Karl baptized. I don't think he grew up Jewish at all, but the whole idea of renaming yourself, getting away from the heritage and whatnot. I think there was some resentment about what it was to be a Jew, and or the fact that you had to be this other religion in order to succeed in Germany. And I'm not sure how much of that got steeped into young Karl's upbringing, but I can't imagine it was absent either.
I think people have claimed that he was 10 or 12 or something when they converted. And people claim, I think some people have claimed that he actually may have been a religious Christian for a time when he was an adolescent. But yeah, it must have been a very weird experience. And then he got thrown out of more than one country, which of course made him very angry and bitter too. He was as you know, he was a huge snob, and he married a woman who was a granddaughter of, I think it was the Duke of Brunswick. And he would regularly tell people, my wife comes from the aristocracy, and he would even invite people to events, and he would note that his wife came from the aristocracy. And then occasionally he'd send these racist letters to people. He was a kind of an appalling human being, but and then he always talked about the exploitation of the working classes, and he had an affair with his maid and got her pregnant and ruined her life, and that's a whole nother story. But these were, most of these so-called great philosophers a lot of them were resentful, angry people. As you say, almost all came from the upper middle class or the upper class. And many of them were very uninterested in how the real world actually functions. So Marx, for instance, seems until very late in his life never to have been in a factory, though industrial labor was the main subject he wrote about. And that's a real contrast with Adam Smith. Smith began Wealth of Nations by describing the operations of a factory. He was really interested in how factories worked. He'd spent time in them. So that's another problem, this absence of field research in a lot of philosophy. And also that contrasts again with people, like Machiavelli and de Tocqueville, who'd actually been involved in governance and who traveled around and met people and, were informed about the world.
So, it's stipulated that you are looking at European philosophy. My understanding is there are a few other continents on Earth. I can't remember all of them. There's Antarctica. I don't know if there's any Antarctican philosophy. And we got Australia. And just so contextually, does philosophy just follow the pathway of the battles and the religions of that area? And so to that point, Eastern philosophy, or Middle Eastern, African philosophy, South America, and or today, who are the philosophers and how are they playing out? So that there's a couple different things, different items you might want to pick from that menu.
I'm probably not qualified to answer that question. I mean, I have read about Buddhism and Taoism and so forth, but I just don't know enough. I really wouldn't be qualified to answer that.
Fair enough.
But
So,
I would say, a lot of what we construe today as Eastern philosophy has a religious component. I mean, people of course have even treated Buddha and Confucius as gods or demigods. And I think you could argue that that's healthy in some ways, and that if you're looking for an ethical component to philosophy, then people are going to take these things much more seriously. And again, one of the problems with philosophy, as it's taught as an academic subject, and as it was written by people like Marx, was that they wanted their ideas to be taken very seriously. But if they're just intellectual conceits, it's very hard to get large numbers of people to improve their conduct or behavior based on it. And that's a profound inherent problem.
Is Jordan Peterson a philosopher?
I don't know his work well enough. I don't know. I've never read his stuff. I don't know. I wish I could answer that question. I can't.
Fair enough. So
I probably
see,
should.
I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. This Zizek guy. How do you say Slavov?
Yeah, yeah.
Slavoj?
He's a kind of quasi-Marxist. He's kind of incorporated a lot of the contemporary popular trends in philosophy, like Marxism. Interesting to note, in 2016 he endorsed Donald Trump because he's a critic of neoliberalism. I have some sympathy for that. Like so many contemporary philosophers, his writing borders on gibberish. So that's a whole nother recent trend in philosophy, though I think it really goes back to Hegel. Since Hegel, there's been a whole phenomenon of academics using the prestige of their academic posts to promote their ideas. And, young people go off to colleges and universities. They're often very uncritical. They're enthusiasts. And they hear people, and they start to take them very seriously, who often are trying to impress them like cult leaders by talking in mostly interminable gibberish. I think Hegel was sort of one of the first to really effectively work in this vein, but there are a whole lot of them today. And Zizek, to some extent, seems to be of that. Derrida obviously is a much more notable figure, though. There seems to be more of a coherent philosophy with Derrida too.
Yeah. So is Karl Marx readable?
No, though, I actually think that this is a complicated subject. The things that he wrote that are readable, he wrote with Engels. And Engels obviously is a much better writer. But I think part of the reason that Das Kapital is so unreadable is that he was trying to square the circle. I think nobody makes this point, but I think it's sort of obvious and implicit. So his basic idea was that, getting back to this labor, unfortunately, going to be a little bit granular here. But, he had this idea that there was something called immiseration. He claimed that the poor would get poorer. Now, in his lifetime, industrial laborers' wages went up a lot, probably doubled. But he had this theory that they were going to get poorer. And he claimed that wages of workers were going to go down. But they didn't. They went up. And they've gone up a lot since. We've had a recent problem of increased inequality because of things like the decline of unions, even more immigration of unskilled workers, increased international trade, et cetera. But overall, worldwide, there's been this huge increase in the wages of industrial workers, which is the opposite of what Marx predicted, though his theory is supposedly scientific and, effective method of prediction. So he had this theory that workers were going to get poorer. He also had a theory that there was going to be a worldwide overproduction of goods and profits of companies would dwindle. And he claimed that this would produce the circumstances that would lead to the revolution that he predicted. Now, there's a problem here, which is that if profits are going down and wages are going down, and that's the whole source of prices, which to a large extent is what he was arguing. I mean, there's a lot more detail we could go into here. He does talk about depreciation, does talk about some other things. But if that's the case, it's actually physically, this is actually impossible. This is sort of like saying 2 + 2 equals 0. It cannot be that wages will go down and profits will go down, and that explains prices. So he has this theory again. So he mentions, as I mentioned, he says there's going to be a worldwide overproduction of goods. So he says there's going to be a problem of supply. But if you say that, what you're really saying is that prices are not based on the wages of the workers and the surplus value or profit. They're actually based on supply and demand.
Right.
So you're presenting a completely different theory in the second half of your prediction. So it's like you start off by saying snow is rain that has gotten colder and it's turned into a solid form. Okay, all right. And then you say, no, rain is actually sulfur. It's actually sulfur dioxide from the mountain. You've got this totally different theory. You cannot combine the two theories. They're totally different. So there was no way that he could explain his ideas. So he just goes on with various critiques of capitalism and occasionally interjects his theories. There's no way that this can work. So the whole thing is totally incoherent, and it just goes on for hundreds of pages. But it reflects the fact that his ideas are incoherent.
Amazing. And yet he still gets sales. I mean, I assume he's not collecting.
No.
But it's just kind of a funny thing because, this Marx stuff is everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's really like, I was before we got on, I was talking about my forays into philosophy as an undergraduate, which were basically nil. This is like, how many strict philosophy classes I took as an undergrad. And I was a chemistry and physics major, and I was interested in sciences and so forth. And, again, maybe like the NBA, I was interested in answers, scores and things that actually, had cause and effect and so forth. You could measure and whatnot. I don't know, probably screw loose in my brain or maybe too tight. Either way. But, I when I went to Yale, there were far fewer gals. It was like a distinct minority of the class. And so, the guys, would look, longingly at a lot of the women around. And they were always carrying, about 3 or 5 of these books by, George Lukács or Gramsci. And I had no idea who these people were, but there was kind of a romanticism about them because in the library, we actually had these things called books back then before smartphones. And, they'd be, reading. And it was just kind of like, at one point, I was one of the girls in like women, whatever, a couple classes ahead of me. I asked her, well, who is this? And like, what actually goes on? What is, and I'm not sure I pronounced the name right at the time, but what is Gramsci? Like, and she started to explain it, but it made absolutely no sense to me, but I smiled anyway. But that's kind of my, grounding in philosophy. I really enjoyed economics though. And I found that, kind of fascinating. I had like a heterodox view. I was lucky to get this guy named Mark Rosenzweig, I think. And he was teaching economics, but really kind of from a dissident position within the economics department, because he was, very strictly kind of a Smithian, Adam Smithian, and very strictly about supply and demand. And we talked about, growing I don't want to get into it all, but, a lot of, as we've kind of, maybe emphasized here, a lot of the better economists are those who, actually had some, were able to, it's like going to a car mechanic who's, never seen a car. And you want your guy to be able to, put the dipstick in or check the spinning of whatever, the matching up of your distributor, whatever it happens to be. And you want them to know something about the cars. And I think that's what Adam Smith and the other, Thomas Sowell and says, have, that they're actually looking at something that actually how they work. So I don't think economics is the only way of doing this. I think there are other ways of bridging into philosophy, through biology or potentially epidemics or, any number of other things. But really the philosophy, if you want to get down to it, is, as you said, a love of wisdom. But it can really divert using a similar root word into sophistry, and which is kind of a misuse. So I think there's philosophy, and maybe we should come up with a new word, philosophistry, where you fall in love with sophistry. Anyway, so we're kind of rounding out the hour here, and I'd like to give people a chance to follow your page, and I'll put it up in a second. But maybe you can. I would love to see you maybe on PragerU or something like that, or someplace go over philosophy, because I think we hear a lot about it, but it's very difficult for people to know the players without a scorecard, and most of the scorecards that are being handed out are probably fallacious.
Thank you so much for all you said and for having me on. Just to get back to Sowell, actually I'd forgotten this, but the thing that caused Sowell to lose faith and interest in Marxism. It's a very specific thing. Essentially, he talks about in his memoirs. He's talked about in a number of places. He got hired, I guess it was when he was in graduate school at the University of Chicago. He got hired to do some work, I think it was over a summer, at the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. And they were doing research on minimum wage laws. And one of the places that minimum wage laws had very perverse effects was, as you might guess, which minimum wage laws, of course, are price floors. They're distortions of the normal mechanisms of the market of supply and demand. Was Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is very poor. And when they imposed minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico, it led to a lot of unemployment. The appeal of setting up factories there, particularly sugar factories, was that the labor was very cheap. Plus, you didn't have to pay federal income tax on the profits of your operations there at the time. So, American sugar producers set up shop there doing the refining. And when they started instituting minimum wage laws, there was a lot of unemployment. And he said that was the first thing that got him to understand just how powerful supply and demand is, and to understand that Marx didn't know what he was talking about. Marx didn't understand economics. And then he started studying with George Stigler, who's considered one of the major figures in the history of economics, particularly dealing with movement of prices. And he studied with Friedman, and he met von Hayek and so forth. But he said even before he'd had any of those encounters, the experience of seeing statistically, it wasn't even going in the field actually, it was just seeing statistically the effect of minimum wage laws on employment. It just changed his whole perspective on economics. And that gets again to, you have to go out in the real world and learn what's going on to have some wisdom. And that's also part of the reason that I think most of us would acknowledge that older people, particularly older people who've had meaningful careers, let's say as doctors, that they have a lot more wisdom than young people often do. And, this is a basic and obvious point.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I went to medical school, but, I hang out here and there with some physicians, and I'm not going to say I'm more worldly because that's kind of a stretch, but I ran my own medical practice for 27 years. And I have to tell you, a lot of things that I think, give me maybe a broader, Isaac Newton was a smart guy. But he said, I'm standing on a lot of what I have is because I've been standing on the shoulder of giants. A lot of what I have is not because I've been standing on the shoulder of giants, but I've been standing on the shoulders of so many others, not necessarily giants, but just regular people. I at various times I had to, have an emergency with plumbing. I'm not going to get more specific about it, but I ran my own practice. You don't have time to get a plumber necessarily. Somebody does something, and I'm running the place. The nurses don't want to touch X, Y, and Z. And I've had to do that. At certain times, there were issues with a leaky, roof or whatever. I've had to come up with situations and answers, and somebody coming in bleeding. There's just different things that you don't hear about in medical school. I've had to balance books. I had to do payroll, back before computers, and I had to do billing before computers and after computers and all that kind of stuff. And it's I didn't have the money running my own practice to get everybody to do everything for me. So, I learned. I didn't really do spreadsheets at the beginning, but over time, you learn how to do stuff. You have to be able to figure out your accounts receivable. You have to be able to figure out how to pursue and whether to pursue, debts and whatnot, whether to collect copayment. There's a lot of things that are economic in a sense. Economy, is Greek, and it really comes from the word for home, and figure out how to run your home. It's a management tool, and I think we have a lot of people who are very smart in a sense, but don't know how to manage things. I mean, we see this in, I mentioned the college protests earlier, and basically we have the weirdest, most ludicrous ideas essentially coming out of campuses because people have had this postpone of having to actually figure things out in order to pay for the things they're getting. And they're at the tail end of one thing or another of getting, stuff handed to them. And it's a sadness in a way. Anyway, I do want people to see your book, and I've read it, and I'm not going to missay it this time. City of Angles. I missaid it previously, because obviously it's referring to Los Angeles. But I love this book. I'll be honest, it took me a little bit to get into it. Probably first few chapters before I started rolling along. I think you have an interesting way of writing and sensibility. People can find more of that through your Substack. Here and there, I kind of see myself as a cryptic crossword guy, and when I know a lot of words, and I had to go hunt for some of your words, and I find that interesting to see them in context. but people can follow a couple of your novels here, City of Angles, and you've got Herd Immunity as a book, and then there's various chapters of your history of philosophy. And so if they enjoyed our discussion and discourse and exegesis today, they can go to your Substack and contribute and get the higher level content. And lastly, if you want to help support my efforts here, I have a book called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. Completely oops, I don't think I put any of this stuff up. I apologize. I'm in backwards order. Here's the page with my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. If you want to help support the video cast, you can go buy the book. It's even better if you read it. That would be lovely. The Substack is here. It's Jonathan's Substack. That's named after you, I guess, unless there's some other Jonathan. And here is a City of Angles on Amazon, and maybe sold elsewhere, but that's where I purchased it, and I recommend people go buy it. So thank you for all that, and people can find you, I guess. You've written elsewhere, but any final words?
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm grateful to be on this show, and I think you're brilliant, and we will talk more.
All right, perfect.
And I hope people they buy both of those books, and they go to the Substack.
Great. Will they get a discount?
Well, no, but it's not that expensive. Neither is expensive.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm going to actually leave one last plug, because this is my latest piece. It's a little bit different segue, but it's the methadone maintenance ignited America's opioid crisis. I write for Brownstone, and I think this I learned so much. I mean, what I really enjoyed about writing, as opposed to my medical career per se, is that medicine, you wind up doing a lot of things you already know. When I'm doing writing, I learned so much that I didn't as I'm doing it. So that's you don't want to experiment on people, but when you're writing, you can somewhat experiment where your knowledge base takes you. So thank you so much. Look forward to hearing more from you and getting to meet you again.